Welcome to this meeting of the Victoria chapter of the Australian Academy of Liturgy. Today our speaker is Garry Deverell, and it seems to be something of a tradition now that Garry gets invited to speak for a chapter meeting following a conference. Garry's presentation today arises out of a discussion that he initiated in the recent online national conference. For those of you who are less familiar with Garry, a few pieces of information, and this will hopefully give you an idea of the riches we're in for tonight. Garry Deverell is Lecturer and Research Fellow in the new School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Divinity. He is a well-known member of our chapter and a contributor to the life of the Australian Academy of Liturgy, and is, of course, my very wonderful predecessor as convener in this chapter. Garry's recent book, Gondwana Theology, marked an important turn towards theologising the experience of Indigenous peoples within and beyond the colonial church. It is very significant that this book includes a set of liturgical texts offered for use in Australian churches. Garry is a priest of the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne and a member of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Anglican Council. He has taught courses in liturgy and preaching at Trinity College Theological School and Uniting Church Theological College. He has also contributed to courses in ecclesiology and history at Whitley College and Monash University. This year, Garry will be teaching a subject introducing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander approaches to theology through Trinity College Theological School in Melbourne. Today's presentation is titled Christ as Country, Liturgical Implications of an Indigenous Christology. It arises from discussions, as I said a moment ago, at the recent national conference, which Garry himself led. Today's presentation offers the broad contours of a Christology which claims that country is, for Indigenous people, what Christ is for Christians. He will consider that claim in the context of the Christ and culture debates which have dominated First World discussion since the late 1940s, and then propose that none of these contributions need be authoritative for Indigenous Christians because they exclude their primary religious text, which is the land and sea and waterways from which Indigenous people are born and to which they return when they die. Garry will then propose some liturgical implications for this point of view with regard to ritual notions of time, space, body, and text. So it is a real joy to welcome Garry to be with us today and to speak. And so, Garry, now I will hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Kieran. That all sounds very ambitious, doesn't it? Oh dear, never mind. It's lovely to be with you, and lovely to see so many faces on the screen who are known to me from days gone by and days present as well. So it's wonderful to be in such company. I'm going to share with you are developing thoughts. They're not completed thoughts, if anyone can have a complete thought. But I'm working on a number of projects at the moment, and this is one of them, which I hope will sort of find its way into another book towards the end of this year. So this is a chapter, will become a chapter in the book that thinks about liturgy in relation to an Indigenous Christology. So let me begin by talking about what country is for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And obviously I'm talking in broad brushstrokes because there are over 300 nations on this continent, and everyone will have their own particular sort of spin and take on this, but I think that what follows might well be reasonably representative of how most of us think about this stuff. So we're all born from the watery womb of country. That country feeds us with the pure nectar of her own life. From the beginning of creation and in every moment, country dies. But by her death, everything that is dead is made alive. Country teaches us who we are and how we are to live. Country is our mother, our father, our uncles and aunties, our sisters and our brothers, our cousins. Country is our kin. And in her familial body, we find that all creation, plants, animals, even the starry host above, are kin to us as well. Country teaches us to care for our kin as country cares for us. Country bids us to imitate what we see in country, to watch, to listen, to imbibe and to notice, to take what we learn into ourselves and to write it on our own hearts. And when we die, country takes us into the heart of her own death, that we may be born to an intimacy that is more wonderful than anything we could think or imagine. So that's kind of my little poem about country, if you like. Perhaps as a bunch of Christians, you will have noticed some analogical similarities in that description with the way that Christians think about Christ. This leads me to conclude that country functions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as Christ functions for Christians. In other words, as Aboriginal people look to country for a sense of identity and belonging and nurture and life, so Christians look to Christ. Precisely how these two realities are related, of course, is a very complex question for Christian theology. And I decided that I wouldn't, Kieran, in fact, go into all the detail about the various models that Christian theologians have drawn up concerning the relationship between Christ and culture or individual cultures. That's a very, very long and complex discussion. But I've decided I only want to point out that they are, all of them, these models, variations on a simple double bind that seems permanently embedded in Christian tradition because of our Hebrew origins, in fact. The Lord says, represent me, but by no means represent me. This is a fairly fundamental double bind, I suggest, at the heart of all our theology. And there are two important implications of this fundamental structuring of reality as a double bind. On the one hand, none of us can step outside of our human traditions, texts, cultures, landscapes, in a manner which gives us a knowing access to a God's eye view of it all. The God or the Christ who speaks to us cannot be heard except through the complex interactions between materiality, mind, tradition, and the text we call culture. That is, in fact, what Jacques Derrida meant with his famous aphorism, there is nothing outside of the text. On the other hand, all of us retain a sense that all we can know is conditioned or put in play by a mystery, which can never be adequately known or represented by our cultures. And yet, every cultural iteration somehow reaches for this mystery which never presents itself. And so our double bind, represent me, but by no means represent me. This means that it would be unwise to conclude that the Christ of Christians and the country of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are the same thing. There may be analogical or family resemblances, but they are resemblances that we put there, that we make. They do not necessarily represent or express the really real. But this means that it would also be unwise to conclude that Christ and country are entirely unrelated realities, mutually exclusive, symbolic models of the real, which one must make a choice about. Of course, most missionaries told our mobs that they must make a choice. They must reject country, which is the devil, which is evil, and embrace the colonial Christ. Some of us did as they asked, but most of us didn't, even while some of us pretended that we did. It would also be unwise of me to even attempt a European-style taxonomy of what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people actually believe about Christ in relation to country, because except for those whose Indigenous selfhood has been most entirely hollowed out by colonisation, most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Christians do indeed have a both and rather than an either or approach to the living of our lives under these symbols. But we are mostly disinclined to compare and contrast, to measure and to quantify, to formulate and propose in the way that Europeans like to do. Most of us are entirely disinclined towards the meta-language of European theology, which seeks to discern a kernel of continuity across the first-order narratives and rituals of a community, in order to more clearly but quite abstractly state what is true. For us, the truth always lies closer to the earth, to our primary narratives and rituals. For us, theology of the European kind just makes the truth more abstract and disembodied. Still, being a Tralloway man who's been trained in such dark arts, I will seek to outline what a liturgical Christology of country might look like in broad outline. Be aware as I do so that what I mean by the term liturgical Christology is simply this: the coherence of belief and practice, such that what we believe about Christ must be read from what we do in embodied storytelling, the storytelling we call ritual or liturgy. Broadly, ritual performs itself by binding together a number of categories or dimensions of lived reality. I'm going to call them time, space, body, and text. Let's examine the ways in which Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islanders might render the relation or non-relation Christ as country across each of these dimensions. Beginning with time. For Indigenous people, time does not begin in the past, pass through a present and orient itself towards a future. Time is a constant now. Here there is a sense in which what Europeans call the past or a future can be experienced as a present. In ritual, therefore, the stories we are telling are understood to be happening in the present, right now. For the ancestors who created land and waterway and still inhabit land and waterway are still creating and continue to create those things. There may be resonances or family resemblances here with the Christian idea of an eschaton that bends past and future together into a present. I think the biblical story that best represents that from my point of view is Mark's version of the Transfiguration, where apparently dead ancestors speak with a presently alive Jesus, whose future resurrection body is already apparently actualized in the present moment. Remember that in Mark, there is no resurrection narrative. It's almost like the Transfiguration is it. The implications of this perspective for a liturgical Christology would be at least twofold. One, that the church year, with its narrative sense of movement from an ancient past through to a making present of that past through symbol, in order to move the community towards a hoped for but not yet entirely present future, would probably need to give way to something like a locally discerned and ordered series of celebrations which focus on an ancestor Christ who, like the other Indigenous ancestors, represents presence and activity in a kind of eternal now. One possibility for rearranging things might be to use local Indigenous seasons which focus on the activity and movement of local flora and fauna as potential analogues for telling Christ as country stories. 2, recognise that the movement of the Sunday liturgy need not be so set in stone as gathering, word, meal, and sending in that order. That for Indigenous people, these things all co-inhere and therefore the order in which things happen is not so important. Means, including when you turn up and when you leave, I should say. It's only that they happen that is important. The order doesn't matter. That these things happen is important. So moving on to place or space. For Indigenous people, place, and by implication space, is a more important organising dimension of reality than time. Place, the part of the world to which you belong by virtue of being kin with the ancestors who inhabit that place, is the most fundamental determinant of identity, belonging, and responsibility. When Indigenous people walk or swim or sail our boats on the country and waterways to which we belong, it's as if we are walking and swimming or sailing across the bodies of our ancestor creators. We hear their call and attend to our responsibility to care for those places, including the plants and animals that live there along with people. All are our kin. In this perspective, Jesus may be understood as kin too, perhaps one of the ancestors who makes and indwells country. After all, a great deal of his recorded teaching involves lessons gleaned from the non-human world: a mustard seed, a tree, a field, the birds of the air, and so on. The implications of this perspective for a liturgical Christology would be at least fourfold. 1, the physical environment in which we worship should at least closely resemble the land and seascape that is important to local custodians. If a building is absolutely necessary, make it as open to the smells and sights and sounds of that place as possible. Reduce the prevalence of the barriers between inside and outside. Dissolve the thresholds in as much as you can. For Christ as country is communicating through these things, as much as through the objects and artifacts derived from a European heritage. 2, You might also consider bringing the outside inside by designing furniture, vestments, vessels, and windows in such a way that they draw on the imagery of local landscapes. Consider the ways in which analogical links might be made between biblical images of God in Christ and local landscapes. Let the baptismal pool be a pool, and let it be fed from a creek. Let the altar be as gnarled as an old tree, but with a contoured surface, evoking the old covenant and the new, the passion and the resurrection. Let the ambo or lectern stand upon a sculpture of the most important creator ancestor. We already, after all, in some European traditions, sculpt lecterns in the shape of eagles, which works very well on Woiwurrung land, of course, because Bunjil, the creator ancestor, is an eagle. Let's just extend that notion to other local ancestors. 3. I also challenge us to remove imagery that preserves nothing other than colonial imaginations regarding white supremacy, like representations of Jesus and the apostles that have exclusively blonde hair and blue eyes, or like the Bishop Tyrrell window at St John's Morpeth, that has an all-white cast at the Last Supper except for Judas, who is black. And finally, I encourage you to think about worshipping in such a way that people are gathered face to face. They face each other for much of the celebration as primary sacraments of country, rather than persisting with the model of imperial courts that we inherited from Rome, in which people face the backs of their fellow worshippers most of the time, with the priestly class and choir being significantly closer to God than the people are. And let the holy things be in the midst of the holy people. And now to body. For Indigenous people, as I've already indicated in a number of ways, your body does not belong to you alone, for you are part of a community that includes not only the other people who belong to your country, but also the plants, the animals, the waterways, and the landscape itself. You even belong to the stars above, a heavenly body that mirrors in many dreaming stories the way things are below. If we take a Christ as country perspective, then Christ's body includes not only word, bread, wine, baptismal water, the people of God. It also includes, as the apostle to the Colossians says, the whole created order, the whole cosmos, which is called the body of Christ. A number of things follow from this for a liturgical Christology. First, let food continue to be the primary sacrament, the primary symbol of Christ as country. For in both traditions, if they are taken to be distinct, food is the primary sign of divine care, given through death and dying to keep us alive and living. But let us not be bound by the European insistence on bread and wine. I would argue that these are symbols of Christ's body and blood only because they were staple food and drink in the culture from which the biblical texts emerged. They might be at least partially replaced in other cultures by other staples. In a great many Aboriginal cultures, the staple bread is in fact a yam, and the staple drink just water from the network of creeks, which in Aboriginal cosmology are like the veins of country, the means by which country distributes its lifeblood to the whole body. 2, let the community of people itself, rather than the clerical class, become primary symbols of Christ as country. This can be expressed in the ritual context, not only by the spatiality of facing each other, as I've already said, but also by a more regular and active participation of the whole community in what is done and said. In Aboriginal society, there is no simple distinction between a priestly class and people, especially in the performance of ritual. Yes, certain elders have responsibility for bringing people together, to design, to rehearse and perform the rituals, and their experience and knowledge with the dreaming is taken seriously as genuine wisdom. But this acknowledged authority only rarely translates into ritual performances in which the elders do most of the work. They're actually more like directors or choreographers who work with people beforehand so that they'll be ready to participate and take their part in what will unfold. Some of you will, of course, argue that this is what clergy are supposed to be in authentic Christianity as well, and that may well be true in theory. I hope it is true. It's just that in all my years of ecumenical wandering, and I am an ecumenical wanderer, I've rarely seen it happen in practice. 3. I've already talked about the ways in which the Christ body that is country can inhabit the liturgical space of our buildings. What I would add to that is a careful attention not only to visual arts and media, but also to the senses of hearing, smell, and touch. If the doors and windows are not there, or at least wide open to country, the smells of country can make their way into the space. And many of those smells are associated with the way in which country dies in order to maintain its life. Surely a kind of passion play in olfactory mode. The sounds of country, the music of country can also intrude. The songs of birds giving praise, the breezes in the trees like ancestral spirits or Holy Spirit, connecting and communicating. The movement of tides with their missional movements of gathering and dispersal and their echoes of labour and childbirth. The sound of rain, lifeblood to give dead seeds life and grow into trees, like Christ being raised to shelter all creation, and so on. This is territory for poets and musicians. And finally, I come to texts. Possibly the least important part of the whole mix. Texts. For Indigenous people, written texts are not at all part of the way in which wisdom was passed on from generation to generation. Wisdom was passed on by conversation, by a great deal of behavioural modelling, and by ritual storytelling, you know, dancing, singing, and all that. Ceremony. For us, the primary text is actually country itself. The stories that tell us who we are, to whom we belong, and what we are responsible for are written there. The land speaks, but in a voice far more multi-layered and deeply interfused than even the greatest of human choirs could hope to produce. Country even speaks with a voice that sounds very similar to that of Christ, who lives and dies and lives again to give us as human creatures who participate in his gratuity, that very same life and death and life again. I've hinted at that analogy often along the way. So what relationship can there be between the text that is country and written liturgical texts? Well, kind of counterintuitively, possibly quite a lot. It's important to remember that the primary texts of Christians, the collection we call the Bible, and the texts which were slowly and painstakingly created as aids to the ritual performance of its message, have their origins in an oral and ritual tradition which did not, on the whole, involve the use of written texts at all. Traditions, stories, rituals were remembered. They were not written down, except in time of crisis, when communities were being pulled apart and the possibility of oral transmission was at risk. like for the exile to Babylon, like when Jerusalem was being destroyed by the Romans and religious communities needed to scatter to the four winds. The Bible is therefore marked by orality in the way that it preserves conversations and arguments between different schools of thought, in the way that it preserves multiple versions of the same stories that are ever so slightly different to each other, in the way it preserves stories which are clearly bodily performances before they became texts. And the earliest surviving liturgical texts of the Church are, by modern standards, extremely minimalistic. They assume that the local community has a great many prayers and stories and rituals already committed to memory. Written liturgical texts, which are expansive and printed so that people could read them in church, obviously only arrived very late to the cause. Their prevalence and scope grew in proportion to the literacy of the people of God, first with many monastics and clergy, and then later with the larger part of the people of God, at least in Western Europe and its colonies, at least amongst white people. In much, but not all of the white European world, a dependence on written texts which are made available to everyone has almost completely replaced orality, which means that rituals have come to depend more upon reading and less upon creative or dramatic storytelling. It also means that liturgical texts tend to be created at some distance from the language, culture, and local life worlds of the people who end up using them. It also means that going to church has become more of a head activity than a body and heart activity, if you like. Particularly in those churches where the liturgy is created new every week and is therefore all the more dependent upon the literacy of the congregation. But in these churches, remembered prayers and ritual actions are of little use, and those who cannot read are almost entirely excluded. In a world where novelty is king, there is little use for such things. So, what does this all mean for a liturgical Christology? Well, it means, one, that when the Christian tradition speaks of Christ as the Word of God made flesh, it is using a metaphor. In the Hebrew tradition, somewhat paradoxically, the Word of God is usually and mostly oral. Yes, some of it was written down in moments of national crisis, but the written text was never supposed to supplant oral and ritual transmission. And not for Christians either. The Word of God in Christian tradition is primarily a person who lives and communicates through multiple means, including parables, and whose life, death, and resurrection might then be interpreted as itself a parable, as Whitley says. Books, in other words, especially books of liturgical rites, should never be mistaken for either the law or the Word of God. The letter kills, the Spirit gives life, said St. Paul. 2. There is a great deal to be learned from oral cultures, like those of more intact and stable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, which, at the same time, have wonderful memories for rituals, but rarely feel the need to freeze them in written texts. The word of life is living. It is ever old and ever new, old like the stories of creator ancestors, new because those stories can be told over and over again, but a little differently each time, in order to address the needs of the community as it stands right now. So let us learn from the Bible and let us tell its stories. But must there be such a hard and fast division between the reading and scripture and preaching? Can't the preaching include a retelling of the stories, retellings that already address the community? And if there must be written prayers, Let them be more poetic and open to slippages in meaning. Let them lack the precision of this paper. Let them leave room for interpretation. And let them be performed and not merely read. Let them be adequately prepared. And if there must be written prayers, let them speak of God and of Christ using the language of country. Let them refer to sights and sounds and smells and a sense of place that is locally capable of speaking about Christ. And finally, let there remain large sections of the liturgy that are committed to memory by the whole community. Memory aided by music, preferably. A memorialisation not only of word, but also of action, so that all for whom the written text is inaccessible by dint of education or culture can still participate. So in summary, I think that an Indigenous Christology, a Christology of Christ as country, has certain implications for the way we think about liturgy, about the way we do liturgy, and the way that we write liturgy. And I would be so bold as to suggest that if Christianity itself is to be more at home in this continent than it actually is, engaging with this country and with the tale that it tells of Christ might be a good place to begin. So thank you, everyone. There are my thoughts in process, and I'll hand back over to you, Kieran.
Thank you, Gary. There is so much there, and we're greatly enriched by your words and your sharing with us of your thinking. As you were speaking, I was prompted in my mind on two questions. I've been fascinated in the last couple of weeks as I've begun to read a book that's come out recently from Margot Neal and Lynn Kelly on songlines as part of a recent series of books on first knowledges. And I was struck in what you were saying in the conclusion of your paper about the importance of the linkage of music and memory, but also what you said towards the middle of your presentation about the role of elders as facilitators of others in the enactment of ritual. That in a sense, and you and I have spoken about this before, that in a sense, Christianity functions almost as a songline, but we're sort of a bit in denial about it. That this is actually something that's deeply primal in us, regardless of where we originate. But anyway, I was prompted to cross the street outside my house in my mind and to mentally walk into the centre of the cathedral where I work. And as you face the altar, if you look to your left and your right, you will see two memorials on the wall near the front of the cathedral. The first one is very small. It's dedicated to the faithfuls, who were the first people among the Europeans to make claims on the land here. Their repression of the local Pangarang people was, to say the very least, brutal. And you'll see that memorial if you ever visit Wangaratta Cathedral on your right. If you turn to your left, there's a much larger memorial to the Reverend Joseph Docker, whose house was just out of town on what's now known as Docker's Plains, and the estate was known as Bontharambo, or Botharambo in modern language. Docker is remembered by the local people as a protector, that when the faithfuls came after the local people, they went to the Docker farm and the Dockers hid the local people and facilitated their survival. And moving back into this landscape, I'm mindful of the ways in which colonialism certainly continues, and Gothic churches are, if nothing else, a symbol of that. But also that, in a sense, colonialism is itself a form of secularisation, of disenchantment, of alienation of the reality of land, and the commodification element that's inherent in all of this. And it seems to me that what you're putting forward to us is a program for resacralising, or rather recognising anew, the sacred character of the country on which we walk and where we live and move and have our being, if you'll excuse that blatant quote. And it seems to me we've got some songlines to weave and learn here. And so thank you very much for what you have offered us today, and which I'll certainly be taking up in my discussions as a way of offering challenges and fruitful paths to people. We do have some discussion time. There are two people who have put forward questions already, and I'd encourage anybody else who'd like to say something by way of a question or a reflection or a response, either to use the raise your hand function under reactions in your Zoom tools, or just type it in the chat box, and firstly, everybody will see it, but secondly, that will prompt me to call you to speak. And when I say your name, please do unmute and hold forth. The first question was from Michelle, and she was asking about parallels between Indigenous and colonialist Christian experiences and hints of Israelite, Canaanite, Asherah, foreign worship of the Hebrew Bible. Michelle, I wonder if you would like to unmute and perhaps say a little more about that question, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. So, like in the Hebrew text, there's often these things about foreign gods, and sometimes it's connected to Asherah worship, sometimes it's not, and fertility gods and things, which seems to be like potentially the indigenous Canaanite religions, which is being squashed by the Israelite Yahwistic religion that comes through in the text. And as Gary was speaking about the quashing, or the intention to quash Indigenous spirituality by sort of colonialist Christian moves, it struck me that there are perhaps parallels in those two situations that perhaps we can learn from, which requires us to read against the text in sort of a feminist mode of reading with suspicion.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, Michelle. There's a whole range of discussions here. Lots of lines of inquiry we could go off, but I mean, pretty clearly, particularly in the early colonial history of this country, there were lots of church leaders who made analogical parallels between the movement of the people of Israel into what they called the Promised Land and the displacement of the Canaanite tribes. And, you know, along with that was a kind of a theological discourse about the superiority of Yahweh over against various Canaanite deities. And occasionally things get very, very brutal. For example, in Deuteronomy 8, and 9, which is one of our Australia Day texts in the Anglican Church's lectionary, where, you know, the Lord is said to tell the people when they move in the land, they are to kill all the people, men, women and children, and all the animals, and lay the land waste, it says. So W.G. Broughton, first Bishop of Australia, actually used these passages in the Committee on the Aboriginal Problem that was put together in 1830. He actually used these passages to bolster his claim that the reason why Aboriginal people needed to be taken care of, even to the point of justifiable killing, was because they were wicked in the same sense as the Canaanites were wicked, and uses very much the same kind of language as you find in Deuteronomy chapter 8 or 9 to make that claim. So there are all kinds of parallels there. But obviously, you know, in the light of contemporary biblical scholarship, we can see that there's actually debates going on within the Hebrew Bible, which are probably debates between theologians in Babylon about why they ended up in Babylon. And the Deuteronomistic history, which dominates obviously the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges in particular, takes the view that the reason we ended up in Babylon is because we didn't do what we were commanded to do. We didn't kill everyone. We didn't wipe the place clean. We didn't ethnically cleanse. We stupidly made agreements and treaties with people. We intermarried with people, and we took on some of the local deities and practices, you know. So that was the Deuteronomic argument, but thankfully for us, there are traces of other versions of the argument in those same texts where treaties clearly were made. I mean, I was reflecting on Sunday in my homily on the difference between the covenant with Abraham or Abram that you have in chapter 12 of Genesis versus what you have in chapter 15 of Genesis. In chapter 15 of Genesis, Abram, for the sake of his legacy, it seems to me, his patriarchal legacy, is promised that when he goes into the land, he'll displace all of the Canaanite indigenous tribes. But in the chapter 12 of Genesis version of the covenant, he's supposed to be a blessing to all nations, you know. So there's two versions of the covenant there, which probably reflect two different theological schools about what they should have done when they went into the land. So I think, you know, there's lots of biblical discussion that, in a sense, mirrors the kind of discussion that we're having in a country where there's a dominant colonial culture, but there's around the margins, there's a continuing and surviving counter argument or counter perspective, which perhaps at certain moments might actually gain enough strength to question the dominant story. In the same way as those alternative texts in the biblical tradition might be able to be used to contest the sort of dominant story that's being told. And arguably, the prophets and Jesus in continuity with those prophets are part of that sort of minor literature, which becomes a more major literature at certain points, but then recedes again when colonialism becomes the dominant paradigm in Europe. So there's a whole heap of directions we can go there, absolutely, I'm sure.
Alison put up a question about the description of God as ground of our being. Alison, I wonder if you would like to unmute and say something more about that question.
Well, as Gary spoke about understandings of country, ground of our being, which is one of the important images for me about God, and has been for a long time, because I had a fire sale on much of the descriptions of various aspects of the Trinity a few years ago, because I was upset about language. And that was one of the images, descriptors, concepts that I kept coming back to. And for me, it still seems to speak when you think about understandings of country, and I'm wondering how Garry thinks of that.
Look, Alison, you won't be surprised to know that I think, you know, the ground of our being is as good an image as we have in lots of ways. It's just unfortunate that the person mainly associated with that, Paul Tillich, who wrote extensively about the ground of our being, did it in such a metaphysical and disembodied kind of way. You know, it was just so bloody dense and metaphysical, and you know, in a sense, exactly the opposite of what you might expect when you talk about ground or earth, or to use the Latin tradition, humus, you know, humility, close to the earth. So that's the paradox, I think, about that phrase, and that's why I you know, have reservations at exactly the same time as I think, you know, it can be useful. I guess it has to be redeployed. And you know, part of what I'm suggesting with various kinds of indigenisation is to take concepts which are there in the European tradition and redeploy them in slightly different directions, so that they can actually come alive again in a different context, you know, and resonate and have something to say which is worth hearing and listening to and seeing. So I think this is one of those images which can be redeployed in that way, for sure.
Thank you, Alison and Garry. We've got time for maybe one or two more questions, and the floor is open. Stephen.
Just get myself unmuted here and my hand down so that I can talk clearly. Hi, Garry. Thank you very, very much for a very thought-provoking and somewhat deep perspective. Get really thinking about a lot of issues there. As you know, I come from the Baptist tradition where we deal with a lot of very conservative people who, in my case, have a perspective that would be very black and white, if you pardon an intended pun, about what is and what is not Christian. I'm interested in your reconciliation within yourself of how those two things have come together in your life. I have some very close friends who one of whom is an elder in Warramai country, where I come from, in Newcastle area. And he has a very evangelical perspective and participates in the Aboriginal Evangelical Fellowship. And I think for them, they've almost denied their Aboriginality, but it keeps coming through. They can't help it. And I appreciate your thoughts. Thank you. Hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and it's a very often asked question, actually, from all kinds of different Christian traditions. There's a spectrum, obviously. You know, Indigenous people, you know, have spectrums just as much as everyone else that we operate out of, which are largely affected by, surprise, surprise, our contexts and what's happened to us and our histories, just like everyone else. So it's true. The Evangelical Aboriginal Fellowship, the EAF, most of the people that I personally know in that sort of grouping, you know, are really very, very uncomfortable about any kind of continuing Indigenous cosmology, because most of them come from families that were raised on missions, the missions which said all of that stuff is evil and you need to embrace our version of Christianity, and you know, and that has kind of continued on. But as you say, there's a continuing spirit, I would say, that sort of pops up and asks the question from time to time: is that really what makes for life? Then you've got people at the other end of the spectrum, and there'd be a lot more of these folk around, you know, Tasmania and Victoria, I suppose, and parts of New South Wales, who would say we don't want to have anything to do with Christianity because Christianity is just, you know, the white man's religion. It's part of the apparatus that's been deployed to oppress us, and therefore we don't want to have anything at all to do with it. So there'd be people on that end of the spectrum, and most of those people are very much interested in sort of the recovery and expansion on more traditional forms of Aboriginal cosmology. And many of them are in fact academics who are working on that sort of stuff. Where I sit personally in that sort of broad spectrum is I'm probably about here, Steve. So, you know, I'm a little bit left of centre from where I'm looking, probably a little bit right of centre from where you're looking. So, but I'm not in the centre. I'm definitely further up the end that wants to be sort of critical of the dominant Christian discourses that have come from Europe, but also doesn't want to throw, you know, that particular baby out with any bathwater. So it does seem to me that there is room for conversation. The other thing that informs the way I think about it, Steve, is that I don't think it's actually possible in a country that has been as brutally colonized as this one has to not contend with Christianity. There's a sense in which every single Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person who is trying to recover lost or repressed traditions and cosmologies, inevitably, whether we're conscious of doing it or not, draws upon European and Christian thought to do it. Because part of what colonization means is that you can no longer think apart from the colonized view of the world. And once you've thought it, you can't unthink it, you know? And so that's the reality. So I think that any work that goes forward here, either explicitly as a kind of Christian theology, which is far more contextual in engaging with Indigenous people, or indeed those people who simply want to recover Indigenous cosmologies and Indigenous sort of religious perspectives about country, will, whether we're aware of it or not, continue to draw upon European and indeed Christian theological categories. I just think that's anyone who thinks that you can do that without Christianity and get back to a kind of repristinated kind of Indigenous spirituality is just kidding themselves, is just having a little fantasy. So I think the best and the brightest understand that. But there's some others who you know, continue to kid themselves about that, I think. Yeah. So even if I wanted, Steve, even if in my deepest heart of hearts, I wanted to be free of Christianity, I couldn't be. It's as simple as that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Steve, for a very interesting and provocative question. It seems to me that sometimes questions like that dramatise the extremes of evangelicalism and Catholicism as tribal categories in our churches. And I think that while we might laugh at it being tribal, it does point to spectrums in which values can be held tightly or loosely, and that this extends to the kind of understanding that emanates from worship as well. We are nearly at the end of our time together. There are a couple of items of housekeeping I need to share, and then we shall share a thanksgiving before we wind up. Firstly, I should say thank you to Gary for an illuminating, challenging, deepening, and in many ways stimulating beyond words presentation today. And I'm very pleased that we're continuing our tradition of inviting you to speak to chapter meetings after conferences. I don't know when the next conference will be, but it's happened twice, so in Anglican terms, it's now a tradition. For the remainder of 2022, the Victoria chapter will be meeting on a Monday or a Tuesday in the second week of the odd-numbered months. I hope, in addition to this, we'll be able to organise a couple of in-person gatherings during the year so we can meet to pray together and then share a meal. There are two reasons for this change. We have opportunities to join together with the Queensland chapter, which meets on a Tuesday in the even-numbered months. So you can spot the pattern here. Their new convener is John Fitzherbert, who is hoping to follow the model pioneered here in the Victoria chapter for online meetings. In my discussions with John, we have agreed very strongly that together we can offer a stronger and more varied program that will be of interest to the broad spectrum of academy people, but also be profitable and fruitful for visitors and potentially members of the Academy of Liturgy who haven't stumbled on us yet. The other reason is a little bit more prosaic and close to home, which is that I have a choir rehearsal at our usual meeting time on Wednesdays. This is part of the inherited pattern of the cathedral here where I now work. And it has proven very difficult to alter the rehearsal to accommodate the academy. So something had to give, or I had to stop. And as I mean to continue, I pray you'll be patient as we find the meeting time for the academy that will work for the greatest number of people. Our next Victoria chapter meeting is on the 10th of March, that's a Tuesday, at 4:30 p.m. I will be making information about this known once I finalise the presenter for the day, and that will be notified through our networks to members, but also to people who have signed up through Eventbrite. Colleen, you have a question.
10th of March or 10th of May?
I'm very sorry, the 10th.
It's all right. It's all right. I thought that's okay.
I'm suffering Lent-itis.
Yep, that's fine. I just thought I needed to clarify and it will help others too. Thank you.
So yes, our next chapter meeting is on Tuesday, the 10th of May at 4:30. Thank you for that. Before we go our ways, I'd like to share with you A Thanksgiving for Australia by Auntie Lenore Parker. Let us pray. God of holy dreaming, great Creator Spirit, from the dawn of creation you have given your children the good things of Mother Earth. You spoke and the gum tree grew. In the vast desert and dense forest, and in cities at the water's edge, creation sings your praise. Your presence endures as the rock at the heart of our land. When Jesus hung on the tree, you heard the cries of all your people and became one with your wounded ones, the convicts, the hunted, and the dispossessed. The sunrise of your Son coloured the earth anew and bathed it in glorious hope. In Jesus we have been reconciled to you, to each other, and to your whole creation. Lead us on, Great Spirit, as we gather from the four corners of the earth. Enable us to walk together in trust from the hurt and shame of the past into the full day which has dawned in Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you in May.